Welcome to this explainer. Okay, let's jump right into it. Today, we're unpacking a massive tectonic shift in the global energy trade. We're talking about a quiet, steady move away from the US dollar, something happening right under our noses. To really wrap our heads around the sheer scale and the mechanics of this, we're going to use a simple, everyday analogy: building and breaking a habit.
So we have to start by asking a pretty profound question. What exactly happens to the global financial architecture when millions of individual transactions just abandon a 50-year-old routine? Think about any personal habit you have. When you change it, right, there's a ripple effect. Well, when the entire global economy changes its fundamental transactional habit, those ripples can literally become a tidal wave.
Section 1. The Global Dollar Habit. This farmer's market analogy is honestly the best way to visualize the foundation of our modern global economy. Think of the petrodollar kind of like this. Imagine you're at a massive international farmer's market. Now, the organizer of this market, which is the United States, lays down a super strict rule. If you want to buy the single most vile good in the entire market, let's call them apples, which stands in for oil, you can't just use your own money. Nope. You absolutely must exchange your cash for the organizer's special arcade tokens, the US dollar. That arcade token system, that is the petrodollar. Born from a massive 1974 agreement between Saudi Arabia and the US, it effectively forces every single country that needs oil to acquire and hold US dollars. And because every nation needs these tokens just to survive, just to keep the lights on, there's this constant, unyielding global demand for US dollars. This perpetual demand props up the dollar's high value. It lets the US run persistent economic deficits because, hey, there's always a willing buyer for its currency. But most importantly for geopolitics, it gives the market organizer, Washington, unbelievable power through sanctions. They control the tokens, so they control who gets to shop at the market.
Which brings us to Section 2. Weaponizing the currency.
Now, the recent conflict involving Iran has acted as a massive catalyst here. Neutrally speaking, when the United States uses this dollar system to sanction Iran's oil exports and blocks their access to SWIFT, the main global financial messaging system, it totally alters the playing field. It creates this immediate, pressing incentive for any trading partner of that sanctioned country to figure out a workaround. Basically, they need a new token. So let's compare these habits side by side. On one hand, we've got the old habit, buying oil with US dollars and routing that transaction through the SWIFT banking system. On the other hand, we have the new alternative, born totally out of necessity, buying oil using the Chinese renminbi and routing it through China's CIPS settlement system, which is essentially their alternative to SWIFT. Just to survive and keep trading, sanctioned entities and their partners are ditching their deeply ingrained financial habits and jumping over to alternatives like CIPS.
Moving on to Section 3, the renminbi migration.
Just look at the sheer volume here, 1.38 million. Before the war, China bought roughly 95% of Iran's crude oil. Because of those sanctions and the shifting habits we just talked about, that entire trade flow, a massive 1.38 million barrels of oil every single day, now settles entirely outside the US dollar system. It's all happening in renminbi via CIPS. That's a huge shift.
Now, add to that first number the roughly 2 million barrels per day of Russian crude oil flowing into China. Driven by very similar geopolitical and sanction-related pressures, this massive volume is also increasingly being settled in renminbi and rubles, bypassing the US dollar completely.
And here's the kicker. It's not just nations facing sanctions that are exploring these alternatives. Even the traditional, cornerstone partners deeply tied to the US token system are testing the waters. We're seeing Saudi Arabia, the exact same nation that helped birth the petrodollar back in 1974, conducting trial oil sales in the Chinese yuan. Meanwhile, the UAE is actively expanding its own non-dollar settlement infrastructure. They are all actively testing out new currency habits.
Let's put this into perspective with the big picture. The global oil trade is this massive pie of about 100 million barrels per day. The slice representing trade that has permanently migrated away from the dollar is over 3 million barrels a day. Now, at first glance, a 3% slice might seem tiny, right? But in macroeconomics, it's not just about the size of the slice today, it's about the momentum. The fact that a structural migration of this volume has successfully and permanently left the petrodollar system, that's what really matters here. Section 4. Implications of shifting habits. Okay, let's walk through these cascading effects. As fewer countries are forced to hoard those US tokens, we start to see a real domino effect. Step 1. Lower global demand for the dollar inherently leads to gradual depreciation pressure on the currency itself. Step 2. Because foreign nations are holding fewer dollars, they naturally buy fewer U.S. treasuries. That means the U.S. has to offer higher interest rates to attract buyers, which pushes up borrowing costs for the entire country. And finally, Step 3. As alternative financial infrastructures like SIPs mature and handle more volume, U.S. sanctions lose their bite, simply because nations now have a viable second option.
There's a quote here that perfectly captures the reality of the situation. De-dollarization is happening, not through a dramatic announcement, through millions of transactions, each one choosing renminbi over dollars. The petrodollar isn't going to die tomorrow in some fiery crash, you know? The dollar is still the world's primary reserve currency. Instead, its foundation is just being steadily eroded from the bottom up. It's happening through millions of microactions, millions of individual transactions, and shifting daily habits that quietly choose an alternative path.
Looking at the historical trajectory, we can see this momentum crystal clear. What started as an ironclad rule in 1974 enjoyed literally decades of absolute dominance. But right now, catalyzed by recent geopolitical conflicts, we are facing the steepest acceleration point of de-dollarization yet. With the new infrastructure firmly in place and being actively tested, projections suggest that up to 10 to 15% of all global oil trade could become non-dollar within just the next 3 to 5 years. I mean, that is a wildly rapid shift in global habits.
As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with this final thought. We've seen how these millions of new transactions are fundamentally restructuring the entire global financial architecture. But ultimately, we have to ask, as the world gradually stops needing those arcade tokens to buy its essential energy, what does this actually mean for everyday life, for inflation, and for the standard of living in the nation that organizes the market? It's a massive question, and it's one that will absolutely define the next decade of macroeconomics. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive.